always unsafe. Sometimes it's simply where your next chapter begins. Welcome to the Soft but Savage Method, Conversations in Becoming. My name is Mickey, I'm your host, and if you're navigating a life transition, whether that's divorce, a big breakup, empty nest, or just feeling like you've outgrown the life that you're currently living, you're in the right place. Every week on this podcast, we have conversations about rebuilding self-trust, emotional stability, and becoming the woman that you're always meant to be. This is episode 8, so let's get into today's conversation. Have you ever looked around and realized the life that you used to fit into doesn't feel right anymore? And the life that you're heading toward is not quite there yet? It's a really strange place to be. You don't feel like the person that you used to be, but you don't yet recognize the person that you're becoming. Friends don't understand you anymore. Some other relationships may be starting to change. And things that once felt comfortable just don't anymore. And that can be really lonely. Not because you're alone, but because you're changing. So today I want to talk about something that I don't think that we talk about nearly enough. And that is the loneliness of transition. First, I want to talk a little bit about why it can feel so lonely. Most of us tend to assume that loneliness means that we're doing something wrong. But loneliness during this life transition is different. You're grieving, but you're not really grieving a person. You're really grieving that identity that you used to have. That woman who always said yes. The one who always tried to make everyone else happy. The woman who knew exactly who she was because everyone expected her to stay exactly the same. And when you start changing, people don't know how to react. They don't necessarily know how to relate to you anymore. Sometimes you don't know how to relate to yourself anymore. Trust me, I understand. So let's just stay here for just a minute. Because I think this is where a lot of women start wondering if they've made a mistake. They may start to think, maybe I should just go back. Not because their old life was healthier, but because it was familiar to them. And our brains love familiarity, even when it hurts us. That's why we may stay in relationships longer than we know we should have. And that's why growth can feel so unsettling. Your nervous system isn't saying, oh, this is wrong, stop doing it. It's saying, I've never been here before, I don't understand what's going on. Those are not the same thing. Maybe you've noticed you don't enjoy the same conversations that you used to enjoy. Maybe you no longer laugh at jokes that used to feel harmless. You don't want to spend every weekend now doing what you've always done. And none of those things are wrong. They're just signs that something inside you is starting to change. So this is true for me when I first moved out of the house that I had shared with my now ex-husband. For over 21 years, my life revolved around other people. My husband, our kids, our grandkids, our parents. If our kids needed a babysitter, I was there. If a holiday was coming up, I was planning menus, decorating, shopping, planning activities, planning to host this event. And if family wanted to get together on a Sunday afternoon, I went. And it wasn't that I didn't love those things, because I did. Sometimes. I love being a mom. I love being a grandma. I love creating those moments for our family that become memories for all of them. I do. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking if those were things that I always wanted. There were Sundays when I really just wanted to stay home instead of spending the entire day at my in-laws. There were days I was just exhausted and I didn't want to babysit. And there were weekends where I just wanted a nice quiet afternoon to myself, whether I spent that reading or napping or sitting on the porch looking at the garden. That was what I wanted. But I didn't say it, because saying no, I don't want to do that was uncomfortable to me. It really was. And so I said yes, again and again and again. Not because I didn't love my family, of course I love my family, but because I had started disappearing from my own life. And so I think so many women probably understand this. We've often been taught, maybe not directly, but through expectations, that being a good woman, a good wife, a good mom, a good daughter, whatever, meant putting everyone else first. Spend time with your parents because they won't always be here. Say yes to the kids because they won't always need you. And enjoy every minute with those grandbabies because they grow up so fast. All those things are true. But something else is true too. It's okay to need time for yourself. It is okay to protect your own energy. And it's okay to build a life that includes you and what you want. So when I moved out of the house that we shared and into my own apartment, I was so excited to be alone for the first time in years. I couldn't wait. I didn't have to take care of anybody else. I could eat dinner when I wanted, if I wanted. I could watch something that wasn't animated or wasn't sports. I could spend an entire Saturday laying on my couch reading a book if I wanted to. I was in heaven at first. At first it was just wonderful. It was amazing. But then it kind of started to feel a little bit lonely. I was used to having people around me all the time. And I wasn't lonely because I wanted my old life back. Far from it. That was definitely not what I wanted. But I guess I hadn't actually thought past what that initial stage of moving on was, right? The happy changes, the exciting changes, the new apartment, the new life. I hadn't thought past that to who I actually am now that I'm not that person anymore, right? Now that I'm not that wife and that person running that household, I'm not that person anymore. And so now I don't really know what I look like. For years, all of my decisions included all those other people. They were based on what would make everybody else happy. And so for the first time, I didn't have to consider anybody else. Generally, I didn't have to consider anyone else in my own household. And at first, that felt really, really freeing. But then once you're actually living it, it can be a little bit different. Because then you're left with the question that nobody but you can answer. And that is, what do I want? What do I want? Even dating felt weird to me. So after being married for more than 21 years, dating felt strange. I was used to being someone's wife. What do you want for dinner? What are we going to do this weekend? Do you want to go here or there or whatever? And then now I'm meeting people as just me. And I don't know who that is. And obviously there were things about that I loved. I could come home afterwards to an empty apartment and be comfortable. And I loved that my time was finally mine and I could make the decisions. But I also missed and still miss having those ordinary day-to-day experiences be a part of my regular routine. It seems like an oxymoron to say I don't want that, but I do want that. And it's not that I want what I had. It's that I was so used to that when I don't have it, then I kind of don't know sometimes what to do with my time. And I think a lot of women, a lot of people can relate to that. You may really, really want your freedom and want your peace and want your solitude. And then it's still okay once you have it to miss some of those other things. Little by little, though, I'm figuring it out. I realized that the job that I was working, while enjoyable, was not providing enough meaning in my life. So I was searching for work that would provide that for me. And that's part of where this coaching program, that's part of where my coaching business kind of evolved from. I realized that, yes, I still love spending time with my kids and my grandkids. Of course I do. But I don't have to say yes every single time. And I realized that this solitude isn't something that I would have to fear because now I don't know how to fill my time. Sometimes it's exactly what I need. So somewhere in the middle of all that, I started building my business, the podcast, my coaching business, all of the things related to that. And this is helping me create a life that I feel deeply aligned with. And that is really, really important. So maybe you'll move on from a relationship or whatever life transition that you're in, and you'll figure out what you want and what you need in a few months, and that's fantastic. Maybe it'll take a few years, and that's okay too. But I can promise you this, that loneliness you might feel while asking yourself, what do I really want? That isn't a sign that you've lost your way. It's often the very place where your new life begins. So loneliness doesn't always mean that you've lost your people, right? Sometimes it just means that you're becoming someone that your old life no longer fits. Growth often feels lonely before it feels freeing. So, if loneliness during this transition is a normal part of the process, how do we stop ourselves from believing that it is something that's going wrong? So here it is, you guys. We really just need to stop thinking that discomfort means wrong. It doesn't. One of the hardest parts of any big transition is that it doesn't just change your circumstances, right? It doesn't change where you live or who's in the household with you or your career or whatever. Yes, those things change. But it also changes then what feels familiar. And our brains love it when things feel familiar. Not because familiar is always healthy, but it's predictable. Our nervous system doesn't spend its time asking, does this make us happy? No, it spends its time asking, does this make us feel safe? Have I survived this before? Those are very different questions. So think about it. If you've spent your whole life putting everyone else's needs ahead of your own, when you finally choose yourself that first time, it is going to be really uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, because it's unfamiliar. If you've spent years avoiding conflict, like me, the first time you speak up, your heart is probably going to just be racing a mile a minute. Not because honesty is dangerous. Obviously, we want to be honest. But because your system has learned to associate honesty with risk. Honesty in the past may have made you feel unloved or unwanted or unsafe in some way. If you've spent years getting permission from everybody around you before you make a decision, trusting yourself for the first time is going to be hard. Again, this is not because what you're doing is wrong. It's because this is something that you've never practiced before. So I think this is where a lot of women might just kind of turn around and give up. They start making changes and then they feel uncomfortable. And so then they immediately think, oh my gosh, maybe this isn't the right path. Maybe this isn't the right choice. Maybe I need to go back. But what if that discomfort is not telling you to stop? What if it's just telling you you're going somewhere or doing something that you've never done before? There were so many times early after my divorce where I would think, my gosh, this is so strange. Not because I wanted my marriage back. I definitely didn't. But it was strange because this was the first time in probably most of my adult life that I could make decisions just for me. So sometimes even figuring out how I spent my Saturday afternoons felt weird. There wasn't anybody else's schedule to consider, and nobody else's opinion to factor into my decision. Nobody saying, hey, what are we doing this weekend? Let's do this. The freedom was wonderful, but it was also a little unsettling because I'd never experienced it before. Sometimes I think that we might expect healing to be peaceful. And of course, that's where we're headed, right? We're headed for peace. That's part of the reason we're doing this. But that process is not peaceful necessarily. You know, kind of like one day we'll wake up and we'll think, oh, everything is right now. That's not usually the way it works. Healing a lot of times will feel really awkward before it feels natural. Boundaries are uncomfortable before they're empowering. And self-trust will feel a little uncertain before it starts to feel steady. A new life, no matter what caused the change, usually feels unfamiliar before it starts to feel like home. So the next time that you are in a season of transition, instead of asking, why is this so uncomfortable? Try asking, could this simply feel unfamiliar? That one question changes everything, because suddenly you're no longer assuming that discomfort means you're failing. You're recognizing it as a new part of living. So here's our becoming moment. The unfamiliar isn't always unsafe. Sometimes it's simply where your next chapter begins. So if discomfort doesn't necessarily mean that you're headed in the wrong direction, how do we keep moving forward before we fully trust who we're becoming? So that's what I want to talk about next. Believing before becoming. So there's a big myth around self-trust where one day you'll just wake up suddenly feeling confident. Okay, that's not true. Confidence isn't something that simply arrives, like an Amazon package, right? It's on your doorstep, you open it up and ta-da, now you're confident. That'd be great if that's the way it worked. But it's not. So think about any relationship that you have in your life. You don't trust somebody because they told you to trust them or because even they said that you could trust them. You trust them because they've shown you through actions and conversations and all of those other ways that they can be trusted. They've been consistent. They have kept their word. They've shown up when they said they would. Trust is not created in one big giant moment. It's built through hundreds of small ones. And I think that the relationship that you have with yourself is built the exact same way. For so many years, I did not trust my own decisions. It was ridiculous. Not because I wasn't capable of making them, but I'd spent most of my life looking outside myself for reassurance. I wanted somebody else to tell me that I was making the right choice. That way, if things didn't work out, it wasn't really my fault. My mom, my sister, my friend, whatever, they told me that's what I should do, and I did it, and it didn't work out, so now it's their fault. Obviously, that's not the way it works either. But eventually, I kind of realized something. Every time I ignored my own instincts, I was just teaching myself that my voice can't be trusted. And every time I honored what I knew to be true, even if it was uncomfortable, I was beginning to rebuild that trust. So here's what that looked like in real life. It was me saying, no, I think I'm just going to stay home today. And realizing that the world is not going to come crashing down. And even if my husband or my family was upset by my decision, that was okay. Because that was on them. That was not on me. It looked like not deciding that I need to explain every single boundary that I set. It looked like spending an afternoon alone without feeling guilty. It looked like saying yes to work that felt meaningful to me and saying no to the things that tried to pull me away from the life that I'm trying to build. None of those moments seemed life-changing at the time, right? But together, they're starting to change my life. So I think we tend to overlook the power of small things. We imagine that transformation either happens all at once, or it happens through these big giant steps, these big decisions that cause us to take huge leaps forward or backwards or whatever. But most lasting change doesn't happen that way. It happens quietly. One honest decision, one boundary, one promise you keep to yourself, and then another, and another, and another. Till one day you look back and you realize that you're not responding the way that you used to. Not because you forced yourself to change, but because you've become someone who trusts herself a little more today than she did yesterday. So if you're in the middle of a big transition right now, please don't wait until you feel completely certain before you take the next step. That certainty might not come first. In fact, it probably will not come first. Sometimes that next step is what creates the certainty. Sometimes confidence is the result, not the requirement. So maybe today your next step is not a huge one. Maybe it's just you asking yourself, what do I actually want? And then honoring the answer, even if it's something as simple as resting, even if it's saying no, even if it's admitting that you've outgrown something that once fit you. Because every time you choose to listen to your own voice, you're teaching yourself that it is safe to trust it. Self-trust isn't built by having all the answers. It's built by honoring the ones you already know. So when you put all this together, the loneliness, the discomfort, the small choices that start to rebuild self-trust, you begin to realize something. Transition isn't just changing your circumstances. It's changing the relationship you have with yourself. And that's where I want to leave you today. So before we end today, I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions to sit with this week. Where in your life are you mistaking unfamiliarity for danger when it might actually be the beginning of your next chapter? And if loneliness wasn't proof that you were doing something wrong, what would you keep moving toward anyway? Maybe today you find yourself somewhere in between. You've let go of the life that no longer fits, but the life you're moving towards doesn't quite feel like home yet. And if that's where you are, I hope you'll remember this. You don't have to have everything figured out to keep moving forward. You don't have to know already who it is that you're becoming. You just have to be willing to keep listening to yourself. Little by little, choice by choice, you'll begin rebuilding a life that feels less like what everybody else expected you to be and more like who you've always been underneath it all. And one day you'll look back and you'll realize that what felt like loneliness was actually the quiet space where you met yourself again. So if today's conversation resonated with you and you're realizing that you are in that in-between season where your old life doesn't fit, but your new one still feels uncertain, you don't have to navigate that alone. This is exactly the kind of work that we do together in coaching. Together, we're going to slow things down, help you untangle the patterns that are keeping you stuck, and help you reconnect with the voice that you've spent so long questioning. If you're ready for that kind of support, I would love to walk alongside you. I've written a companion article on this topic on my blog where we explore it from a different perspective and go even deeper into today's teaching. This week's article explores more fully why this transition can feel so lonely and why that loneliness isn't necessarily a sign that you're doing something wrong. If today's episode left you wanting to understand that experience a little more deeply, I'd encourage you to go read it. And if you're ready to move beyond just listening, I would love for you to explore my Soft But Savage collective. Inside, you'll find the Becoming Journeys, where insight becomes practice through guided reflections, practical exercises, and one intentional step at a time. You can learn more about coaching and all of my resources by visiting my website. The links to my website and everything that we've talked about today are in my show notes below. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this episode encouraged you, consider sharing it with a friend who may really need to hear it too. And if you haven't already, I'd be really grateful if you would follow the podcast and leave a review. This just helps these conversations reach more women who are learning to come home to themselves. Until next time, keep becoming.